The precinct buzzed with the usual chaos of a Monday morning. Phones rang incessantly, officers moved in and out of the bullpen, and coffee machines hummed in the background. Officer Blake leaned back in his chair, feet propped up on his desk, exuding an air of authority that wasn't entirely earned. His reputation among his peers was mixed. He was a capable officer, but his attitude rubbed people the wrong way. Blake had a chip on his shoulder, and it showed in the way he carried himself. He believed respect was demanded, not earned, and often used his badge to assert his dominance, especially over those he deemed powerless. The commotion began when an older woman entered the precinct. She looked out of place among the officers and suspects, her presence quiet but commanding. Her dark skin carried the deep lines of age, each one telling a story of resilience. Her hair was cropped close, and she wore a simple navy blue blazer with matching slacks. She clutched a leather folder tightly against her chest as her eyes scanned the room with quiet confidence. Blake noticed her immediately. She wasn't doing anything wrong, but something about her demeanor rubbed him the wrong way. She didn't look intimidated by her surroundings, and that annoyed him. To him, everyone who stepped into his territory should feel the weight of his authority. "Hey, lady," he called out, his voice cutting through the room. "You lost or something? This isn't a tourist spot." The woman turned to face him, her expression calm and unreadable. She took a step closer, but before she could respond, Blake was already standing. His towering frame and sharp tone were designed to intimidate, and he wasn't about to tone it down for anyone. "I asked you a question," he said, stepping into her space. "This is a police precinct, not a shelter. If you need directions, try the help desk." A hush fell over the room. Everyone stopped what they were doing to watch the interaction. The other officers exchanged uneasy glances, recognizing the tension brewing. This wasn't the first time Blake had acted this way, and they knew it likely wouldn't be the last. The woman's calm demeanor remained intact. "I'm exactly where I need to be," she said evenly. Her voice was steady, with a hint of authority that surprised those listening. Blake scoffed. "Well, if you're here to report something, take a number and wait like everyone else. Otherwise, I suggest you move along." He took a step forward, his posture menacing. It was a tactic he'd used countless times to assert control over a situation. What happened next stunned everyone. Without warning, Blake reached out and tapped her arm, not hard, but enough to communicate that he wasn't asking anymore. The room seemed to hold its breath as the woman's eyes locked onto his. There was no anger in her gaze, just a quiet intensity that made even the most hardened officers uncomfortable. "You need to think very carefully about your next move, officer," she said, her voice low but firm. There was no mistaking the authority in her tone now. "This is not a game you want to play." Blake hesitated for a fraction of a second before letting out a laugh. "You've got some nerve," he said, shaking his head. "What, you think you're my boss or something?" The words hung in the air like a challenge. For a moment, the room was silent, save for the distant hum of office equipment. Then, without missing a beat, the woman reached into her leather folder and pulled out an ID badge. She held it up for everyone to see. "I am your boss," she said, her tone sharp enough to cut through the tension. "Chief Investigator for Internal Affairs. And I'm here to evaluate this entire precinct, starting with you." The room erupted into whispers and gasps. Blake's face turned a shade of red so deep it bordered on purple. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. His confident swagger evaporated in an instant, replaced by a look of sheer panic. "I suggest you take a seat, Officer Blake," the woman continued, her voice calm but authoritative. "We have a lot to discuss." Blake's legs seemed to betray him as he stumbled backward into his chair. The other officers stared, unsure whether to feel sorry for him or relish in the poetic justice of the moment. For years, Blake had been untouchable in his mind, throwing his weight around without consequences. But now, it seemed, his actions had finally caught up with him. The woman's gaze swept across the room, silencing any remaining murmurs. For the rest of you, she said, addressing the entire precinct, I'm here to observe, assess, and ensure that this department operates with the integrity and professionalism the public deserves. If anyone has a problem with that, I suggest you speak up now. Nobody moved. The officers exchanged uneasy glances, but no one dared to challenge her. There was something about her presence that demanded respect. It wasn't loud or flashy, it was the kind of authority that came from years of experience and unshakable confidence. Blake, however, wasn't ready to give up his position as the alpha in the room. After a moment of silence, he forced a smirk onto his face. All right, he said, leaning back in his chair. So your internal affairs. What, you're gonna sit around and write a report? Good luck with that. The woman didn't flinch. Instead, she stepped closer to his desk, her calm expression never wavering. You seem very confident for someone who's under investigation, she said. Her tone was conversational, but there was a sharpness to it that made Blake's smirk falter. Tell me, Officer Blake, are you familiar with the complaints filed against you? Blake froze. His mind raced as he tried to think of a response. Complaints? He said, feigning ignorance. People complain about cops all the time. It's part of the job. Interesting, the woman said, setting her folder down on his desk. She opened it to reveal a stack of papers, neatly organized. Because these complaints paint a very specific picture. Excessive force, verbal abuse, inappropriate behavior. Should I go on? Blake's smirk disappeared entirely. He opened his mouth to argue, but the woman held up a hand to stop him. Save it, she said. You'll have your chance to explain yourself during the formal review. In the meantime, I suggest you reflect on the kind of officer you want to be. Because if these allegations are true, your badge isn't going to protect you. The weight of her words hung heavy in the air. Blake's confidence was shattered, and the rest of the precinct seemed to collectively exhale. For years, Blake had been the loudest voice in the room, but now, his silence spoke volumes. The woman picked up her folder and turned to leave. She paused at the door, glancing back at the room full of officers. This isn't just about one person, she said. This is about the culture of this precinct. Change is coming, whether you're ready for it or not. With that, she walked out, leaving the room in stunned silence. Blake sat frozen at his desk, the weight of his actions finally sinking in. For the first time in his career, he wasn't in control. And he had no idea what was coming next. Blake sat in stunned silence, the chatter around the precinct resuming like a slow-building wave. The other officers threw quick, nervous glances his way, some smirking while others avoided his gaze altogether. His chest tightened, but his mind was already working overtime to figure out his next move. Internal affairs showing up was bad enough, but having that woman her standing there and tearing him apart in front of everyone? That was humiliation on a level he hadn't experienced before. He replayed the moment in his head, over and over. The way she'd spoken, calm but authoritative, as if she'd known exactly how to dismantle him with just her words. And that folder, what else was in there? Was she bluffing about the complaints? Blake knew he wasn't the most popular guy in the precinct, but he didn't think his actions had ever gone far enough to warrant official scrutiny. At least, that's what he told himself. Across the room, his partner, Ortiz, leaned casually against his desk, watching him with raised eyebrows. Ortiz had been Blake's partner for 3 years, and though the two didn't always see eye to eye, they had a working rhythm that made them an effective team. But now, even Ortiz seemed unsure how to handle the situation. You gonna sit there all day, or are we actually gonna talk about what just happened? Ortiz asked, his tone light but probing. Blake shot him a glare. What's there to talk about? She's just another bureaucrat trying to make a name for herself. I'm not worried. Ortiz tilted his head, unconvinced. Uh-huh. Well, she didn't look like she was bluffing to me. And that stack of papers? It wasn't for show. Blake's jaw tightened. You don't know that. Ortiz shrugged. Maybe not. But if she's here for you and it sure sounds like she is, you'd better figure out how to handle it. This isn't something you can just talk your way out of. Blake didn't respond. He hated the way Ortiz was looking at him, like he was already guilty of something. It made him feel exposed, vulnerable in a way he wasn't used to. He stood abruptly, grabbing his jacket off the back of his chair. Where are you going? Ortiz asked. Out, Blake said shortly. He didn't owe anyone an explanation, especially not right now. He needed air, needed to clear his head and figure out what his next move should be. As he pushed through the precinct doors and stepped onto the busy city sidewalk, the cold air hit him like a slap. It was late autumn, and the streets were alive with the sounds of honking cars, distant sirens, and the hum of everyday life. Blake walked aimlessly, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. He needed to calm down, but the memory of the woman's piercing gaze kept flashing through his mind. Who was she? She hadn't introduced herself beyond her title, but there was something about her that felt familiar. Not in a personal way, he was sure he'd never met her before, but in a way that made him feel like she knew him. Like she'd been waiting for this moment, watching and gathering evidence until she could strike. The thought unsettled him. Blake wasn't the kind of man who liked to look back on his past. His career had always been about moving forward, leaving behind anything or anyone that didn't serve his goals. He didn't have time for regrets, and he certainly didn't have time for people who wanted to drag him down. But now, for the first time in years, he found himself wondering if maybe he'd missed something. A detail. A face. A moment that could explain why this woman had singled him out. Blake's thoughts were interrupted by the buzz of his phone in his pocket. He pulled it out and saw a message from Ortiz. She's asking questions about you. Not just the complaints, your history. You better get back here. His stomach sank. He didn't respond to the text, instead shoving the phone back into his pocket and quickening his pace. If she was digging into his history, that meant she was looking for something specific. Something she thought she could use against him. And Blake had no intention of giving her the satisfaction. When he returned to the precinct, the atmosphere had shifted. It was subtle, but Blake could feel it in the way people avoided making eye contact with him, in the hushed conversations that stopped abruptly when he walked by. It was as if his colleagues had already started to distance themselves, anticipating the fallout. He headed straight for Ortiz, who was waiting by their shared desk. What's going on? Blake demanded, his voice low but sharp. Ortiz leaned in, keeping his voice quiet. She's been talking to the captain. And a few others. Asking about your cases, your behavior, even your training record. She's thorough, man. This isn't just a routine check. Blake felt a flash of anger. So what? Let her dig. She won't find anything. Ortiz gave him a long, skeptical look. You sure about that? Before Blake could respond, the woman reappeared. She moved through the room with the same quiet confidence she'd had earlier, her presence commanding attention without effort. She stopped a few feet away from Blake and Ortiz, her expression unreadable. Officer Blake, she said, her voice even. I need a word with you. In private. Blake hesitated. He wanted to refuse, to assert some semblance of control over the situation, but he knew that wouldn't help his case. With a forced nod, he followed her into one of the smaller interrogation rooms. The room was stark and uninviting, with a metal table and 2 chairs under harsh fluorescent lights. Blake took a seat across from her, his posture defensive. The woman placed her folder on the table but didn't open it right away. Instead, she studied him, her gaze steady and unflinching. Do you know why I'm here, Officer Blake? She asked after a moment. He crossed his arms. You're here to do your job, right? Investigate complaints, write up a report, and move on. Her lips curved into a faint, humorless smile. Partially correct. But my job isn't just to write reports. It's to ensure accountability. To make sure officers like you understand that the badge you wear comes with responsibility, not entitlement. Blake bristled at her tone. I know what my responsibilities are. Do you? She countered, her voice sharp. Because from what I've gathered so far, it seems like you've forgotten what it means to serve and protect. Instead, you've been using your position to intimidate and bully. That's not what this badge represents. He clenched his fists under the table. You don't know anything about me. That's where you're wrong, she said, finally opening the folder. I know more about you than you think. I know where you grew up. I know why you became a cop. And I know the choices you've made to get where you are today. Blake's heart pounded in his chest. So what? None of that proves anything. It proves that you've been operating under the assumption that you're untouchable, she said, her voice cold. But no one is untouchable, Officer Blake. Not even you. For a moment, the room was silent. Blake could feel his composure slipping, but he refused to let her see it. He straightened his shoulders and met her gaze head-on. Why are you really here? He asked. What's your angle? She leaned forward slightly, her eyes narrowing. My angle? Justice. Accountability. Making sure people like you don't tarnish the reputation of this department any further. Blake smirked, though the gesture lacked confidence. You think you're some kind of hero? No, she said simply. But I think you've been running from something for a long time. And it's time you faced it. Her words hit harder than Blake expected. He didn't respond, couldn't respond, because for the first time, he felt the weight of her accusation settle over him. She wasn't just here to investigate him, she was here to expose him. And there was nothing he could do to stop her. Blake sat in the interrogation room long after she left, his thoughts churning. The air felt heavy, pressing down on him as he replayed her words. It wasn't just her confidence that rattled him, it was the precision of her attack. She hadn't come at him with vague accusations or empty threats. No, she had been deliberate, each statement calculated to hit a nerve. It was like she knew him better than he knew himself. He tried to shake it off, but the doubts lingered, growing louder with each passing minute. What exactly did she know? Was it possible she'd uncovered something buried, something he had pushed aside long ago? Blake had built his career on the belief that perception was everything. As long as he projected strength, people would respect him. Fear him, even. But now, that armor was starting to crack. When he finally left the room, the precinct felt different. The usual bustle of activity seemed muted, the glances from his coworkers sharper and more curious. Blake's chest tightened as he walked past their desks, each step feeling heavier than the last. He was used to being the center of attention, but this wasn't the kind he wanted. Ortiz caught up to him near their desk, his face a mix of concern and caution. What did she say to you? Nothing I didn't already know, Blake muttered, though his tone lacked conviction. Ortiz didn't look convinced. She's still here, you know. Talking to people, going through files. Whatever this is, it's big. Blake shot him a glare. You think I don't know that? You think I'm just gonna sit back and let her tear me apart? Maybe you should, Ortiz said quietly, his voice steady. If she's got something on you, running from it isn't gonna help. You need to face it. Blake stared at him, disbelief and anger flickering in his eyes. You don't get it, do you? She's not here for justice or accountability or any of that crap. She's here to destroy me. Ortiz hesitated, as if weighing his next words carefully. Maybe. Or maybe she's just here to get the truth. Either way, you can't fight this the way you fight everything else. Blake didn't respond. He didn't want to admit that Ortiz might be right. Instead, he grabbed his jacket and walked out of the precinct again, his mind racing. The city felt colder now, the sharp wind biting at his face as he wandered aimlessly. He needed time to think, to figure out his next move. But no matter how far he walked, the questions followed him. Who was she? Why did she care so much about him? And what was she planning to do next? As the sun dipped lower in the sky, Blake found himself standing outside an old diner he used to frequent years ago. He hadn't been there in ages, but something about it felt comforting, like a relic from a simpler time. He stepped inside, the warm air and familiar smell of coffee and fried food wrapping around him like a blanket. He slid into a booth near the back, his thoughts still racing. The waitress, an older woman with kind eyes, brought him a cup of coffee without asking. She didn't recognize him, but that was fine. He wasn't in the mood to talk. As he sipped the coffee, his phone buzzed on the table. He glanced at the screen and saw a message from Ortiz. She's asking about the Harper case. Thought you should know. Blake froze, his stomach sinking. The Harper case. He hadn't thought about it in years, hadn't wanted to. It was one of those cases that stuck with you, no matter how hard you tried to forget. A young man, barely out of high school, caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. Blake had been the arresting officer, and while everything had seemed straightforward at the time, there had been whispers later. Questions about whether the evidence had been as solid as it seemed. He had told himself he'd done the right thing, that the kid had been guilty. But now, those old doubts came rushing back, sharper and more persistent than ever. Why was she asking about that case? What did she think she knew? Blake's hands trembled as he set the cup down. He couldn't let her dig any deeper, couldn't let her uncover anything that might cast doubt on his career. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized he didn't know how to stop her. Back at the precinct, the atmosphere was electric. Blake returned to find the woman standing in the middle of the room, surrounded by officers who looked both curious and uneasy. She held a stack of papers in one hand, her expression calm but unyielding. As I've mentioned before, my role here is to ensure accountability, she said, her voice carrying easily over the room. That means looking into cases where the line between right and wrong may have been blurred. Cases where justice may not have been served. Blake's heart pounded as her gaze swept the room, finally landing on him. She held his stare for a moment, her expression unreadable, before turning her attention back to the others. I know this isn't easy to hear, she continued. But accountability isn't about punishment. It's about making sure we uphold the values we swore to protect. The words hung in the air, heavy and unshakable. Blake felt a surge of anger, but it was tempered by something else. Fear. Because for the first time, he wasn't sure if he could talk his way out of this. As the woman finished speaking and the crowd began to disperse, she approached him, her steps deliberate. Officer Blake, she said, her tone neutral. We need to have another conversation. In private. Blake wanted to refuse, to walk away and pretend none of this was happening. But he knew he couldn't. Not this time. With a curt nod, he followed her into the interrogation room once more, his pulse racing. This time, the tension in the room was almost unbearable. She placed the stack of papers on the table, her gaze steady and unwavering. Do you recognize this? She asked, sliding a document toward him. Blake glanced at it, his stomach twisting. It was a report from the Harper case, one he hadn't seen in years. His name was at the top, clear and unmistakable. I don't see what this has to do with anything, he said, his voice tight. It has everything to do with accountability, she replied. There are inconsistencies in your report, Officer Blake. Witness statements that don't match the evidence. Decisions that were made without proper justification. He felt the walls closing in, his mind scrambling for a way out. You don't understand. That case was complicated. I did what I had to do. Did you? She asked, her voice sharp. Or did you do what was easiest for you at the time? Blake's hands curled into fists under the table. He wanted to argue, to defend himself, but the words wouldn't come. Because deep down, he knew she wasn't entirely wrong. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken truths. Finally, she leaned back in her chair, her gaze never leaving his. You have a choice, Officer Blake, she said quietly. You can keep running from this, keep trying to cover your tracks. Or you can face it. But either way, the truth will come out. Blake's throat felt dry, his heart pounding in his chest. For the first time, he felt truly cornered, with no clear way to escape. And as he sat there, the weight of her words sinking in, he realized that the hardest part wasn't facing her. It was facing himself. Blake sat in silence, her words reverberating in his mind like the echo of a thunderclap. His throat felt tight, and for the first time in years, he wasn't sure what to say or do. He had always prided himself on being in control, but now, he was teetering on the edge of something he couldn't quite define. The weight of the Harper case, long buried under layers of justifications and deflection, pressed down on him with crushing force. She remained seated across from him, her gaze steady, but there was something in her expression now, something that unsettled him. It wasn't just confidence. It was certainty. She wasn't here to argue or debate. She was here to deliver a reckoning, and Blake realized with a sinking feeling that she might have more cards to play. Before he could respond, the door opened. Another officer stepped in, his expression tense, holding a file that looked older than Blake himself. The woman nodded, gesturing for the officer to place it on the table. Blake felt his stomach churn as the man left, leaving behind an even heavier sense of foreboding. What's this? Blake asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted the answer. She opened the file carefully, as if it were some sacred artifact, and slid another document toward him. It was a report he didn't recognize, but as his eyes scanned the page, the words hit him like a freight train. The Harper case was mentioned again, but now it was tied to something he never expected. A confidential memo from an internal investigation hinted at evidence tampering, only it wasn't Blake's signature on the suspicious entry. It was someone higher up the chain, someone untouchable at the time. But now, that memo was staring him in the face, a reminder that the system he trusted to protect him was far from infallible. Why are you showing me this? Blake demanded, his voice cracking despite his effort to sound composed. Because it changes everything, she said calmly. You weren't the only one involved, Officer Blake. You were following orders, weren't you? Orders you knew were wrong. Blake's pulse quickened. He wanted to deny it, to insist that he had made his own choices, but the truth was more complicated than that. He remembered the pressure, the not-so-subtle nudges. From above to close the case quickly, to make it stick. At the time, he'd convinced himself it was for the greater good. Now, that justification felt hollow. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a near whisper. This isn't just about you anymore. It never was. The system you're so desperate to protect is the same one that's been using people like you as pawns. And if you don't start talking, they'll let you take the fall while they walk away clean. Blake felt his chest tighten, panic clawing at the edges of his mind. This was bigger than he'd imagined, bigger than he was prepared to handle. But as much as he wanted to fight back, he couldn't ignore the nagging thought that she might be right. Before he could respond, the door burst open again, and this time, it was Ortiz. He looked rattled, his usual composure replaced by a mix of urgency and fear. Blake, we've got a problem, he said, glancing nervously at the woman. What kind of problem? Blake asked, his voice sharp. Ortiz hesitated, his gaze flicking between them. There's a reporter downstairs. Says she's got information about the Harper case. She's asking for a comment. Your comment. Blake's stomach dropped. The walls were closing in faster than he'd anticipated, and now the press was involved. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. What did you tell her? Nothing, Ortiz said quickly. But she's not going away. And if this gets out, it's already out, the woman interrupted, her tone unyielding. You think you can keep this contained, but you can't. The truth has a way of finding its way to the surface, no matter how hard you try to bury it. Blake turned to her, his frustration boiling over. You don't get it, do you? This isn't just about me. If this explodes, it'll take the whole precinct down. The trust, the respect, everything we've built will be gone. Maybe it should be, she replied evenly. Maybe it's time to rebuild something better. Her words stung, not because they were harsh, but because they carried an undeniable truth. Blake looked at Ortiz, who nodded grimly. She's right. We can't outrun this. The question is, what are we going to do about it? The room fell silent, the weight of the decision hanging heavily over them. Blake's mind raced, torn between the instinct to protect himself and the growing realization that there might be no way out. And as he stood there, the woman's calm gaze fixed on him, he felt the walls close in a little more. But then, something shifted. A memory surfaced, unbidden and sharp, cutting through the fog of his thoughts. It wasn't the Harper case, but something from much earlier in his career, another moment, when he'd been faced with a choice, when he'd stood at a crossroads and made the easier, safer decision. He told himself it didn't matter, that it was just one moment in a long career. But now, standing here, he realized how those moments added up, how they shaped the person he had become. For the first time, he wondered if it wasn't too late to choose differently. But before he could decide, the woman spoke again, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. You have one last chance, Officer Blake. Tell the truth, or let the lies destroy you. Either way, the clock is ticking. Blake stood frozen, the weight of her words pressing down on him like a tidal wave. The room felt smaller, the air thicker. He could hear the faint hum of voices from outside the door, the muffled sound of officers going about their business, oblivious to the storm brewing within these walls. His heart pounded in his chest as if it knew that whatever came next would define everything. Ortiz shifted uneasily, his eyes darting between Blake and the woman. Blake finally broke the silence, his voice rough and low. If I tell the truth, what happens to me? Her expression softened slightly, but her resolve didn't waver. That depends on you. Taking responsibility doesn't erase what you've done, but it's a start. The real question is, are you ready to face the consequences? Or are you going to let this system devour you like it has so many others? Blake's jaw tightened. He hated how easily she stripped away the layers he'd built to protect himself. He hated how exposed he felt, as if she could see the battle raging inside him. But more than anything, he hated the sinking realization that she was right. For years, he had justified his actions, convinced himself that he was just doing his job, that he was protecting something bigger than himself. But now, faced with the undeniable truth, those justifications felt hollow. Ortiz cleared his throat, breaking the tension. Blake, we don't have much time. That reporter is downstairs, and she's not leaving without a statement. If you don't do this now, someone else will. And they won't care about the truth, they'll just want a headline. Blake looked at Ortiz, then back at the woman. Her steady gaze didn't falter, and for a moment, he envied her conviction. He took a deep breath, his chest tight with the weight of what he was about to do. Fine, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. I'll talk. But not here. The woman nodded, standing up and gathering the files she had laid out on the table. There's a press room downstairs. We'll do it there. Publicly. Blake's stomach churned at the thought, but he knew she was right. There was no point in hiding anymore. If he was going to come clean, it had to be in the open, where everyone could hear it. He followed her out of the room, Ortiz trailing behind them, his expression a mix of apprehension and support. As they descended the stairs, Blake's mind raced. He thought about the Harper case, about the faces of the people whose lives had been shattered by his decisions. He thought about the countless times he had looked the other way, convinced that he was doing what was necessary. And he thought about the moments when he could have chosen differently but didn't. The press room was small but packed. Reporters filled the seats, their cameras and microphones pointed at the podium at the front of the room. The buzz of conversation died down as Blake entered, his presence commanding attention. He felt the heat of their gazes, the weight of their expectations. His hands trembled as he approached the podium, but he clenched them into fists, forcing himself to steady. The woman stood beside him, a silent pillar of support. She didn't say anything, but her presence was enough. Blake cleared his throat, his voice cracking as he began to speak. "I've spent my career telling myself that I was doing the right thing," he said, his voice echoing in the room. "That I was protecting my community, serving the people who trusted me. But the truth is, I've made mistakes. I've looked the other way when I shouldn't have. I've followed orders I knew were wrong. And because of that, people have suffered." He paused, his throat tightening as he forced himself to continue. "The Harper case is one of those mistakes. It's a case that has haunted me for years, and it's time for the truth to come out. There were orders given, orders that came from people much higher up than me. But I made the choice to follow them, and I take responsibility for that." The room was silent, the weight of his words hanging heavy in the air. Blake felt the sweat on his brow, the pounding of his heart. He could see the reporters scribbling in their notebooks, their cameras capturing every word. But he didn't stop. "The system we've built is flawed," he said, his voice growing stronger. "It's a system that protects itself at the expense of the people it's supposed to serve. And it's time for that to change. I'm here today to take responsibility for my actions, but I'm also here to say that this isn't just about me. It's about all of us. It's about the choices we make every day and the people who are affected by those choices." He took a deep breath, his chest heaving as he looked out at the crowd. "I don't expect forgiveness. I don't expect sympathy. But I hope that by speaking the truth, we can start to make things right." As he stepped away from the podium, the room erupted into a flurry of activity. Reporters shouted questions, their voices overlapping in a chaotic symphony. Blake felt a hand on his shoulder and turned to see the woman, her expression unreadable. "You did the right thing," she said quietly. Blake nodded, though he wasn't sure he believed her. He felt exposed, vulnerable, and uncertain about what came next. But for the first time in years, he felt something else too: relief. The weight he had carried for so long was finally starting to lift. As they left the room, Ortiz caught up to them, his face pale but determined. "Blake, there's something you need to see," he said, holding up his phone. Blake frowned, taking the device and looking at the screen. His heart sank as he saw the headline, "Leaked Memo Reveals High-Level Corruption in Police Force." The article was accompanied by a photo of the same confidential memo the woman had shown him earlier. "It's already out there," Ortiz said. "Someone leaked it to the press." Blake felt a chill run down his spine. The system he had spent his career protecting was crumbling around him, and there was no telling what would come next. But as he looked at the woman beside him, her calm resolve unwavering, he realized that maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something better.